The sun was sinking low over the riverbank, painting the sky in streaks of gold and blood red, when the quiet of the evening was shattered. The water rippled lazily, carrying the scent of wet earth and willow leaves, and somewhere upstream, a bird's cry cut through the fading light. In the midst of this tranquil scene, a woman walked carefully along the soft, muddy bank, her hands cradling the curve of her belly. Each step was measured, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows cast by the trees. She was not alone for long. From the dense thicket across the river, 3 men emerged, their boots crunching against twigs and gravel, voices low and rough, carrying the sharp scent of whiskey and sweat. They circled her slowly, the sunlight glinting off a knife in one man's hand. The woman's heart pounded, but she didn't run. Fear and caution battled within her, and somewhere deep down a spark of hope flickered, though she could not name why. The men's intentions were clear without a single word. They closed in, their presence overwhelming the soft rustle of the river and the evening breeze. The pregnant woman tried to back away, but the uneven ground betrayed her, and a low gasp escaped her lips. Then, from the far side of the bank, a figure appeared, silent, steady, moving like the wind through the grass. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a look in his eyes that carried both fire and calm. He did not speak, yet the men sensed him immediately, pausing mid-step as if the air itself had shifted. The stranger's hand rested lightly on the bow slung across his back, fingers brushing the arrows tucked inside. The flicker of danger in his eyes told a story of battles fought, of lives defended, of a code older than the frontier towns and rough-hewn cabins nearby. The woman's breath caught as she looked at him. He was an Apache warrior known in whispers along the trails and settlements near the river. Tales of his bravery were as common as the wind through the canyons, though few had ever seen him. His presence alone brought a strange comfort, a promise that the odds could still turn in favor of the defenseless. But even with him there, the tension hung thick in the air. The men weren't ready to back down, their boldness matched only by the desperation that had driven them into the wilderness that evening. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the river, mirroring the uncertainty that gripped the woman's heart. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to hide, but her legs refused, as if rooted by the gravity of the moment. The Apache took a careful step forward, the soft leather of his moccasins barely making a sound on the soil. His eyes never left the intruders. There was no hesitation in his stance, no hint of fear, only a readiness that could only come from a lifetime of survival on the untamed land. The men exchanged uncertain glances, their bravado flickering. It was a silent standoff, a battle of wills as palpable as any fight with knife or gun. The river beside them seemed to hold its breath, the water shimmering unnaturally in the dimming light, reflecting the tension like a mirror. The woman, sensing the shift, felt a tremor of hope, but knew better than to relax. Danger had not yet passed. The 3 men moved as one, testing him, circling wider now, their voices rising in mockery. "Think you can stop us, stranger?" one called, his words slurred but sharp.
Atch!
The Apache's eyes didn't waver. His hand lifted slightly, not in threat but as a signal, a silent warning. The air seemed to hum with the promise of swift action, and for a moment the men faltered. The woman's pulse raced. She could feel the earth beneath her feet hard and unyielding, and the river brushing at the shoreline cold and indifferent. Time seemed to stretch, the sun dipping lower, leaving streaks of fire across the horizon, painting a scene that felt larger than life, yet intimately terrifying. Her mind raced through every story she had heard as a child. Every tale of frontier justice, of men and women surviving against odds that seemed impossible. She thought of the Apache's reputation, whispered in awe by the settlers and feared by outlaws. He was a protector of the land, a guardian of those who could not defend themselves. And now, somehow he was here. She dared a glance at him, hoping to catch a hint of reassurance. His gaze met hers briefly, steady and unflinching, and in that fleeting moment, she felt a strange courage rise inside her. The men laughed then, a low, bitter sound, though it carried a tremor of uncertainty. They began moving again, more cautiously this time, as if the warrior's presence had reshaped the rules of engagement. But one man, braver or more foolish than the others, stepped forward, knife glinting in the waning sunlight. The tension snapped like a drawn bowstring. The Apache reacted in the blink of an eye, muscles coiling and releasing with practiced precision. Arrows were nocked, but not yet fired. Every breath, every step, every heartbeat was crucial. The river murmured beside them, oblivious to the drama unfolding on its banks, as if nature itself was watching, waiting. The woman felt a cold sweat prickling her skin. Her hands trembled as she instinctively pulled her shawl tighter around herself, though it offered no real protection. She wanted to cry out, to run, to do anything to end the terror that gripped her, but the fear was paralyzing. Her eyes never left the warrior, who stood firm, an unspoken promise of defense etched into every line of his body. He was her only hope now, the thin barrier between safety and a danger she could not yet name. Then, suddenly, the three men froze again. Their laughter and words cut short by a distant sound, a howl carried by the wind, sharp and wild. It was not the Apache nor the woman, but something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The moment stretched, a silent countdown before the inevitable clash. The warrior shifted slightly, his stance widening, ready for the fight that would decide the fate of the woman and the child she carried. The river reflected the last streaks of daylight, its surface disturbed only by the anxiety of the moment, ripples racing like the tension in her chest. Everything hung suspended, the world reduced to the three men. The woman and the Apache, each waiting for the first move, the first spark that would ignite the confrontation. She could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears, and wondered if she would live to see the next sunrise. The warrior's gaze swept over the attackers once more, calculating, anticipating, knowing the terrain, the possibilities, the risks, and in that quiet before the storm, she understood that her fate rested in his hands, though she did not yet know whether the night would end in salvation or tragedy. A single arrow twanged against the bowstring, a soft, chilling note in the evening air, and the men flinched. The warrior did not rush. He did not need to. Every fiber of the moment was charged with potential, a collision of courage, danger, and raw survival instinct. And as the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the riverbank, the woman realized she was witnessing something larger than herself, a story of bravery, of fear, of lives entwined by the decisions of a single warrior in the wild American frontier. But even as hope flickered, uncertainty remained. The first move had yet to be made, and the night was still young, full of threats hidden in the darkness. The air thickened with anticipation, the river whispering secrets as the leaves rustled in a sudden wind. The woman gripped the shawl tighter, her eyes darting between the men and the warrior. She felt every second stretch into eternity. And then, from the edge of the clearing, a shadow shifted, a hint that more danger could be approaching, unseen, unpredictable. She swallowed hard, knowing that the story of this night was only beginning. That survival would demand courage, cunning, and perhaps a touch of fate. The river gurgled softly, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, and the woman, heart hammering, realized that whatever happened next would change everything forever. The first stars glimmered faintly above, silver points against the deepening indigo sky, while the river's surface reflected the last flickers of light like shards of broken glass. The pregnant woman shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the earth beneath her feet. Her thoughts raced, chasing memories that had been buried beneath months of anxiety and travel. She had been moving through the frontier lands for weeks, carrying more than just the life growing within her. She carried stories, secrets, and a past that some men would kill to uncover. Her journey had begun with hope, a desire for a fresh start far from the crowded towns and trading posts. But the wilderness had a way of testing even the strongest resolve. The Apache warrior had not spoken since he appeared, but his presence told a story older than words. He had watched her for miles along the river, tracking her from the shadows with an almost supernatural awareness of the land. His knowledge of the forests, the hidden paths, and the rhythm of wildlife gave him an edge no ordinary man could match. He understood the danger she faced because he had lived it, had seen the greed and cruelty of those who would take advantage of the weak. His eyes, dark and unyielding, seemed to weigh every detail, the tilt of a head, the tension in muscles, the rustle of leaves, calculating not just the present, but what might come next. The three men lingering on the bank were not ordinary bandits either. Each had a history marked by the shadow of desperation and crime, lives spent on the edge of the law, surviving by force or cunning. They had been following her for days, drawn by whispers of her journey and the rumors of a child she carried. Rumors that promised wealth, influence, or leverage to those foolish enough to think they could seize it. One of them, taller than the others, had scars along his forearm, pale against his tanned skin, stories etched into flesh from previous fights and misadventures. Another had a cruel grin, teeth slightly yellowed from years of neglect, eyes cold and calculating. The third, smaller but wiry, moved with a quiet menace, his hand never far from the knife he had brandished moments ago. Together they formed a triangle of danger, pressing her toward the river, as if the water itself might become her prison. The woman's mind wandered briefly, recalling the events that had brought her here. She had left behind a settlement filled with whispers and suspicion, where she and her husband had once hoped to build a life. Her husband had been a kind man, skilled with words and tools, but the frontier was unforgiving, and danger often appeared where it was least expected. He had disappeared months ago, leaving her alone with her burdens and a small, tattered journal that contained the map of her journey and cryptic notes about the land she must cross. Every entry in that journal had led her here, to the riverbank, where danger now crouched like a predator. Her eyes scanned the forest, the tree line, the river's edge, searching for a path forward, for anything that might offer escape. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, moving closer without a sound. His presence was a calm in the storm of her fear, though she did not yet fully understand him. She had heard stories from traders and travelers of Apache warriors who moved like shadows, who could read the land as if it were written in a language only they could understand. They spoke of courage and honor, of protecting those who could not protect themselves. And now, standing before her, he embodied all of it, every story she had ever heard, yet more than she could have imagined. His dark hair, braided and tied with strips of leather, brushed his shoulders, and his eyes glimmered with an intensity that made the men hesitate. It was not just skill they sensed it was inevitability. But the men were not so easily dissuaded. The taller one stepped forward again, his voice grating against the quiet of the evening. "We don't need to hurt her, not yet. Just hand over what she's carrying, and nobody gets hurt." There was a tension in his voice, an edge that betrayed fear beneath the bravado. The woman's fingers trembled, brushing against her belly instinctively, as if to shield the life within. She knew what they wanted, and she knew they would not stop until they had it. Her heart pounded in her chest, echoing the rhythm of the river, the trees, the world around them. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the uneven ground and the closeness of the river made that impossible. The Apache made no move, no threat beyond the silent challenge in his stance. But every line of his body was taut, ready to respond at a moment's notice. He had fought for survival and protection countless times before, and he understood the importance of patience. The river offered him cover, the forest offered escape routes, and the men's ignorance of the terrain gave him an advantage they could not comprehend. His hand rested on the bow again, flexing the fingers that had been trained since boyhood to act without hesitation. The arrow was ready, but it was not the first choice. The warrior understood the value of strategy over brute force, of observation over rash action. As the shadows lengthened, the woman's thoughts drifted to the wilderness itself. The frontier was beautiful, but it was also merciless. Rivers could carry life or death, forests could hide friend or foe, and every path was a choice between risk and safety. She remembered the nights she had spent under the open sky. The stars above her like distant witnesses to her journey, the wind whispering secrets through the trees. She had learned to read the land, to respect it, to understand that it was indifferent to human struggle, yet intimately connected to survival. And now, standing on the bank, she realized that her knowledge of the frontier, however small, would not be enough without help. The men shifted again, circling, testing the boundaries of the warrior's patience. The smaller one moved closer to her, his eyes glinting with malice, and she felt the cold edge of fear grip her. But there was also a strange clarity in the moment, a recognition that her fate and the fate of the child depended entirely on the next few moments. The Apache's eyes followed every movement, predicting, calculating, preparing. He had been watching them before they even arrived, and he knew that any rash action could mean disaster, yet he did not waver. His silence was louder than their words, and in that silence, the woman sensed a kind of power she had never encountered before. Her mind returned to her past, to the long months of preparation and escape, to the stories her mother had told her as a child about courage and perseverance. Every step she had taken had led to this moment, though she did not fully understand why fate had brought her here. The Apache's presence offered hope, but the danger was still real, still pressing in, a living thing that crept along the riverbank. She could hear the water lapping against the stones, feel the cool evening air brushing her skin, and every sense was heightened, alert to the possibility of sudden violence. The warrior finally shifted again, a subtle movement that seemed almost imperceptible, yet carried weight. His eyes never left the men, his posture relaxed but ready, as though the land itself had given him permission to act when the time was right. The woman felt a flicker of reassurance, but she also knew that hope alone would not save her. The night was deepening, shadows stretching long and strange, and the men's intentions were as sharp and unpredictable as the knife they carried. Every step, every breath was critical. She could sense that the river, the trees, and the ground beneath her feet were part of a larger pattern, a web of choices and consequences she was only beginning to understand. The tallest of the three men cursed under his breath, his patience fraying. He glanced at his companions, their faces a mixture of fear and frustration. Something about the warrior unnerved them, the calm certainty of his presence, the way he seemed to merge with the land. They had not anticipated this. They had expected fear, panic, easy prey, and instead they were met with quiet strength, with a silent promise that any misstep could be their last. The woman swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every second pressing down on her chest. She wished she could step back, could escape the trap of the riverbank, could change the story she found herself in. But the warrior's eyes met hers again, steady and unwavering, and in that gaze, she understood that survival was possible not through luck, but through courage, observation, and the unexpected arrival of someone who could protect her when all else failed. The wind shifted suddenly, rustling the trees and carrying with it a sound that made the woman's pulse quicken. Somewhere deeper in the forest, movement hinted at unseen eyes watching, perhaps allies or enemies yet to reveal themselves. The river seemed darker now, reflecting shadows that were not entirely natural. She realized that this night held secrets she could not yet know, that the struggle before her was just one piece of a much larger story, one that involved danger, bravery, and perhaps the very essence of survival in the unforgiving frontier. And as the stars climbed higher, the woman felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The Apache warrior remained her shield, the men her immediate threat, and the land around her both ally and adversary. Every moment was suspended in tension, the air heavy with anticipation. She knew that what happened next would test the limits of human courage, that the choices of a single night could change lives forever. The river whispered, the trees watched, and the first flicker of night creatures began to stir, signaling that the wilderness was alive, and anything could happen under the cover of darkness. The woman tightened her grip on her shawl, took a deep breath, and glanced at the warrior, hoping for guidance, praying for protection. The three men were circling again, more cautious now, their bravado waning, but not entirely gone. The first move had not yet been made. The storm had not yet broken, and the tension remained a living, breathing thing between them all. The river gurgled softly, carrying the secrets of the forest downstream, and the woman knew that whatever unfolded next would test every instinct, every ounce of courage she had left. The warrior shifted his weight slightly, his eyes narrowing, as if reading not just the men but the land itself. His silence was deliberate, a warning as sharp as any blade, and the woman felt a flicker of hope that was both fragile and fierce. She had survived this long on determination, on courage, and on the instinct to protect the life within her. But now she understood that survival might depend on something far greater, the skill, bravery, and quiet strength of the Apache warrior who had appeared just in time, as if drawn by fate itself. The night was settling in fully, darkness wrapping the riverbank like a cloak. The tension between the three men, the woman, and the warrior was as palpable as the cool evening air. Every sense was alive, every movement critical, and the first act of the night had yet to unfold. The woman's heart beat steadily, but her mind raced, knowing that the story she had been living was only beginning to reveal its deepest secrets. The river whispered, the shadows shifted, and the wilderness held its breath, waiting for the moment that would determine life, danger, and the fragile balance between them. The night had fully claimed the riverbank now, a blanket of darkness broken only by the silver glint of the water and the pale light of distant stars. Every sound was magnified, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot, the steady rhythm of the river as it traced its path downstream. The woman pressed herself closer to the earth, feeling the weight of the night around her and the looming presence of the three men whose intentions had been made clear long before they stepped onto the bank. Her pulse raced, yet beneath the fear, a thread of determination wove through her thoughts. She had come too far, carried too much to falter now. The Apache warrior moved with a quiet precision that made the men uneasy. He didn't just stand guard. He observed, calculated, anticipated. His eyes flicked from one man to the next, noting subtle, tells-a twitch of a hand, the shift of weight, the tension in their shoulders. These details, invisible to an ordinary observer, were the difference between life and death. He had learned over years of roaming the wild lands that every encounter carried risk, and that the smallest misstep could bring ruin. In the shadows, he became part of the forest, blending with the darkness, letting the men underestimate him until it was too late. The tallest man cursed under his breath, glancing at his companions. "We shouldn't have followed her this far," he muttered, though not loud enough for the woman or the warrior to hear. His words, however, carried a tremor of doubt, a crack in the armor of bravado that had held them together until now. The woman noticed the hesitation and felt a small spark of hope. Even the cruelest men could falter when confronted with courage they did not understand. The second man, wiry and restless, shifted his gaze toward the river, perhaps considering retreat, perhaps calculating some desperate plan. The third man, the one with the cruel grin, stayed closest to her, his hand hovering near the knife, a silent reminder that danger was never far. The woman tried to make sense of the situation, piecing together the threads of her past that had led her here. She remembered the map her husband had left her, the cryptic notes about hidden trails and secret crossings. Each step of her journey had been marked with uncertainty and risk, and yet she had pressed forward, driven by hope and necessity. Now standing on the bank of the river, she realized that the dangers she had feared were not only real, but amplified. She could sense the weight of their intentions, the way the men's eyes lingered on her, measuring, judging, deciding. Every instinct screamed for her to act, but there was nowhere to run, and the river offered no refuge for someone unprepared for its currents. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes never leaving the men. His presence was a constant reminder that they were being watched, that their movements were anticipated. He had seen this scenario before in countless variations: men who thought they could take advantage of the vulnerable, only to find that the wilderness and those attuned to it held their own rules of justice. He had spent years moving silently through forests and along rivers, reading the land, listening to its whispers. Now he used all that knowledge to guard the woman, to protect not just her life, but the life she carried, a future none of them could yet imagine. The men were growing restless. The tallest one took a step forward, voice rising in irritation and menace. "We're wasting time here. Move aside, and maybe we won't have to get rough." His words were meant to intimidate, but the calm steadiness of the warrior made them falter. The woman felt a shiver of relief at his composure, realizing that in this moment, strategy and patience were stronger than brute force. Still, the threat was immediate and tangible. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the murmur of the river was amplified by fear and anticipation, each moment stretching longer than the last. She remembered her mother's stories about the frontier. Tales of people surviving against impossible odds, of cleverness and courage, winning battles that seemed unwinnable. Those lessons were no longer just stories, they were lifelines. She tried to calm her breathing, to slow the pounding of her heart, knowing that any sign of panic could give the men an advantage. The warrior's presence offered some security, yet she understood that survival would not come from him alone. She needed awareness, caution, and the instinctive understanding of the land her husband had tried to teach her before his disappearance. The smaller man, quick and wiry, made a sudden movement, testing the warrior's reaction. In an instant, the warrior's hand was near the bow, fingers brushing the fletched arrow. The man froze, realizing that any attack would be met with precision, speed, and lethal skill. It was not just fear that gripped him, it was recognition. He had underestimated the man before him, and now he could feel the danger he could not escape. The tension was a living thing, pulsing between them like an electric current. The river itself seemed to hold its breath, its waters reflecting the darkness with an eerie stillness, carrying the weight of the moment downstream. The woman's mind wandered to her journey, to the days spent moving through settlements, avoiding the gossiping eyes of neighbors and the predatory stares of strangers. She had learned to read people as carefully as she read the land, to recognize danger before it became unavoidable. And now, faced with the men on the bank and the warrior protecting her, she realized that survival depended on more than just speed or strength. It required understanding, intuition, and courage in the face of uncertainty. Every glance, every twitch, every breath mattered. The tall man shifted his weight again, frustration mounting. His patience had limits, and he could feel the resolve of the warrior pressing down like a physical weight. He knew that one wrong move could cost him, but retreat felt like defeat, and defeat was not in his nature. The wiry man looked at him, a flicker of doubt crossing his features, while the one with the cruel grin stayed rigid, knife-ready. Their dynamic was fragile, built on fear, greed, and a desperate need to assert dominance, and it was cracking under the weight of the warrior's quiet authority. The woman sensed the moment of indecision and drew a slow, steadying breath. She felt the life within her, small and insistent, reminding her of the stakes. She could not afford to give in to fear, could not allow panic to dictate her choices. She shifted slightly, testing the ground, feeling for uneven soil, for the grip of roots and stones. For any advantage she might gain if forced to act, every detail mattered. Every sound, every shadow could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The Apache moved slightly closer to her, still silent, his presence a shield as much as a warning. He was attuned to the land in a way the men could not understand, reading the river, the trees, and the wind for clues. His knowledge extended beyond instinct. It was a learned, lived wisdom, sharpened by years of necessity. He could anticipate attacks, predict movements, and respond with a speed that would seem impossible to anyone unfamiliar with his skills. The men sensed this, and the tension in their bodies betrayed the unease they tried to hide behind threats. The woman's thoughts drifted again to the people she had met along the frontier. 2 travelers, traders, and settlers, each with their own stories of survival, loss, and courage. Some had warned her of the dangers of wandering alone. Others had offered fleeting help, moments of kindness in a harsh world. She realized that every person she had met, every lesson she had learned, had brought her to this riverbank, to the edge of a confrontation that could change her life forever. She felt a strange mix of fear, hope, and determination, knowing that she was not helpless, that she had the power to act wisely, even in the shadow of imminent danger. The river whispered beside them, carrying the echoes of unseen creatures and distant movement. The night seemed to expand, stretching the distance between light and dark, safety and threat. The warrior shifted his stance, reading the men as carefully as they read him. Every detail mattered: the tilt of a head, the tightening of a fist, the angle of the knife. The woman felt a strange calm despite the danger, a recognition that in the wilderness, survival often came from patience, observation, and the quiet courage to wait for the right moment. The men, sensing the growing advantage of their opponent, began to circle again. Slower this time, more cautious, yet their intent remained clear. The tall one muttered another curse, frustration and doubt mingling in his voice. The smaller man's movements became twitchy, uncertain, while the one with the cruel grin kept close to the woman, eyes cold and calculating. The tension between them all was a living, breathing entity, feeding on fear, anticipation, and the unspoken understanding that the first move could tip the balance. The woman swallowed hard, her mind racing through every lesson she had learned about the land, about people, about survival. She understood that the Apache warrior was not merely a protector. He was a guide, force shaped by the wilderness, by experience, by a deep understanding of life and danger. And yet, she knew that the night was far from over, that threats remained not only in the men before her, but in the shadows that stretched beyond their sight. Every step, every sound, every moment was a test, and she had to be ready for what would come next. The warrior's eyes flicked toward the distant tree line, noting movement that could be friend, foe, or simply the forest shifting in the night. The woman felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her, the awareness that survival would require more than courage. It would demand focus, instinct, and trust in the unexpected. The men were still circling, still assessing, still dangerous, and she realized that the night held many possibilities, each with consequences she could not yet foresee. The river's whispering grew louder, the darkness thickened, and the tension on the riverbank was a palpable force. The woman adjusted her stance slightly, the life within her reminding her that every choice mattered. The Apache warrior remained her silent sentinel, every muscle coiled and ready, eyes scanning for the first sign of aggression. And in that suspended moment, with stars glimmering faintly overhead, the woman understood that the story unfolding was not only about danger and survival, but about courage, resilience, and the fragile thread that connected life to the wilderness, to chance, and to the unseen forces that shaped the frontier. The night had deepened into a velvet darkness that seemed almost solid, pressing down. On the riverbank, and the narrow strip of land where the woman and the warrior faced the three men, the river's surface had turned inky black, reflecting only the faint glimmer of stars, as if the world itself had been reduced to shadows and whispers. Every sound, the hiss of wind through leaves, the soft lapping of water against the shore, the creak of a branch underfoot was amplified in the silence, carrying the weight of imminent danger. The woman's breath came in shallow bursts, each one trembling with fear, yet tinged with determination. She had survived this long through awareness and will, but the night demanded more. The Apache warrior remained a quiet sentinel beside her, eyes scanning the darkness, every muscle coiled with readiness. Fingers brushing the arrows fletched in leather and feather, prepared to act at the first sign of aggression. He had learned that in the frontier, hesitation could be fatal, and yet he moved with patience, understanding that timing, not speed, would decide the coming confrontation. The men before them sensed it, to the quiet authority of someone who knew the land, the night, and the rules of survival far better than they did. Doubt flickered across their faces like the last fading sparks of a fire. The tallest man, restless and impatient, shifted his stance. His voice cut across the night, rough and jagged. "We don't have to do this, you know? Just give us what we want and walk away." But the words were hollow, carrying more frustration than authority. The wiry one muttered under his breath, clearly weighing options that offered little comfort. The third man, closest to the woman, let the knife glint briefly in the pale starlight, the sharp edge catching a silver gleam that made her flinch. She could feel the cold steel's presence even from a distance, a reminder of how close the threat had become. The woman's mind spun with memories of her journey, the long days of travel, the nights spent hiding under the open sky, the strangers she had encountered who had offered kindness and warning alike. Every lesson, every caution had led her here, to this riverbank where danger pressed in on all sides. She had learned to read the land, to sense when the forest whispered of hidden paths, and when rivers carried more than just water. Now every instinct told her that survival would require careful observation, swift thought, and courage that reached beyond herself. The warrior shifted slightly, eyes narrowing on the men, reading the subtle cues that betrayed their intentions. A slight twitch of a shoulder, the tight clenching of a fist. The shallow breaths held too long. These were the language of danger, and he understood it fluently. He had seen similar confrontations countless times, and he knew that even a single moment's hesitation could turn the night into tragedy. Yet his patience was a shield as much as his bow, and he remained calm, biding his time, waiting for the precise moment to act. The men exchanged glances, frustration and unease evident now. They had expected fear, compliance, easy prey. Instead, they faced a woman who held her ground despite trembling, and a warrior whose silent strength radiated through the darkness. The riverbank, once seeming open and vulnerable, had become a stage for a tense standoff. The woman felt a flicker of hope, fragile as the first glow of dawn, and yet she knew that hope alone could not protect her. The life she carried demanded vigilance, and every moment of indecision could prove fatal. Suddenly, the smallest of the three men lunged slightly, testing the limits of the warrior's patience. I'm right. But with bid. But I'm dotting what? I'm dot. I'm like I'm not or I'm not. I'm not. I'm dot. I'm dot. I'm on my I'm on I'm not. I'm lie. I'm London. I'll wash. The man froze mid-step, realizing he had underestimated the skill and speed of the figure before him. His companions hesitated, confusion and fear flickering across their faces. The river seemed to hold its breath, the water dark and reflective, mirroring the tension like a silent witness to the confrontation. The woman's pulse hammered in her chest. She could feel the rhythm of the river, the breath of the night air, and the weight of the moment pressing on her. Every instinct screamed at her to act, yet there was nowhere to move, nowhere to hide. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, muddy and slick, offering no advantage. The warrior, sensing her tension, shifted slightly closer, an unspoken reassurance that he was ready, that he would protect her as best he could. His eyes flicked to the men again, noting the subtle hesitation in their movements. The longest moments stretched, each one brimming with the possibility of violence. The tall man cursed, frustration bleeding into anger. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, knife in hand. "Don't think we're afraid of you," he growled. The words were meant to intimidate, but the warrior's calm gaze did not waver. The woman could see the calculation in his eyes, the anticipation of what might happen next, the readiness for every conceivable move the men could make. It was a silent warning they could not ignore, a presence that made even hardened criminals second-guess their audacity. The woman's thoughts drifted again, back to the journey she had taken, the miles she had traveled alone, and the hope that had carried her through. Her husband had disappeared months ago, leaving her to navigate the dangers of the frontier. She had clung to the stories he had told her, to the lessons of the land and survival. Every path she had taken, every decision she had made, now converged on this riverbank. And yet, even as fear tightened its grip, she sensed a fragile possibility that courage, careful observation, and the presence of the warrior could turn the tide. The wind shifted suddenly, rustling the leaves with a sharp whisper. Shadows stretched and shifted along the riverbank, dancing in the darkness, as if alive. The men tensed, and the woman pressed herself closer to the earth, eyes wide. Somewhere in the forest beyond, movement hinted at unseen observers, perhaps animals, perhaps others drawn by the same whispers of danger. The Apache warrior's gaze flicked to the tree line, scanning the darkness with trained precision. Every sense was alert, every muscle ready, every instinct honed for the confrontation that had become inevitable. The smallest man stepped closer to her again, knife flashing in the dim starlight. The warrior's hand lifted slightly, an arrow knocked and ready, the fletch brushing the bowstring like a whispered warning. The man froze, realizing the precariousness of his position. His companions shifted as well, the tall one muttering another curse while glancing at the river, calculating escape routes, second-guessing every decision. The tension was nearly unbearable, a living thing pressing against the woman's chest and squeezing tight around her heart. Her mind raced. She could not act rashly. She had no weapon, no skill to match theirs in direct combat. Her only advantage was awareness, patience, and trust in the warrior beside her. She studied the men, noting the minute tells, the twitch of a shoulder, the shifting of weight, the way the knife hand lingered slightly too long. Every detail mattered. She understood that her life, and the life she carried, could hang on a single observation, a single decision in the next few moments. The Apache adjusted his stance, moving with the fluidity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the land and predicting danger. His eyes swept over the men once more, noting the tension in their bodies, the subtle signs of fear beneath their bravado. He had faced countless threats like this before, yet each one required attention, strategy, and a calm mind. One wrong move could trigger violence, but patience and precision offered the chance to protect the woman and the child. He did not rush. He waited, every sense attuned to the moment that would determine the outcome. The river whispered beside them, carrying the night sounds downstream, its current dark and unpredictable. The woman felt the life within her stir, a small but insistent reminder that she could not falter. Every decision mattered. Every heartbeat was a countdown. Shadows around them seemed to grow longer, as if the darkness itself anticipated the clash. The men were circling now, slower, more deliberate, tension coiling in their muscles, every step measured against the invisible threat of the warrior. A sudden rustle in the trees drew all eyes momentarily. The tall man glanced toward the movement, uncertainty flashing in his gaze. The wiry one stiffened, while the knife-wielding man tightened his grip. The woman felt her own pulse spike. The wilderness had always been alive, full of unseen forces. And tonight it seemed to amplify the tension, turning every shadow into potential peril. The Apache's hand remained near the bowstring, every fiber of his being attuned to both the land and the people upon it. Time stretched, the moments becoming long and taut like drawn threads. The men exchanged hurried glances, their initial confidence eroding under the weight of the standoff. Fear flickered in their eyes, mingled with stubbornness and greed. The woman realized the complexity of the night threats were not only in front of her, but all around, hidden in darkness, carried in whispers of wind, and reflected in the river's cold surface. Survival demanded every ounce of awareness she could summon, every lesson learned from months of navigating the frontier. The warrior's presence was a steadying force, but even his skill had limits. The men were unpredictable, desperate, and dangerous. Any movement could ignite violence. The woman held her breath, aware that the first strike would change everything, and that she might not have the luxury of acting afterward. The night seemed to close in, the darkness thickening, the river murmuring secrets as it flowed silently downstream. And then a distant howl echoed from the forest beyond, sharp and haunting. All three men flinched, their attention momentarily split. The woman felt a chill run down her spine. The wilderness was alive with eyes and ears she could not see, and the sound reminded her that danger existed on more than one front. The warrior's hand tensed on the bow, his gaze sweeping the surrounding darkness, every sense alert. The riverbank, once a simple stretch of land, had become a stage for an impending confrontation, the climax of fear, courage, and survival drawing ever closer. Every heartbeat throbbed like a drum in the night. The shadows seemed to move with intent, the wind carried tension, and the river whispered warnings. The men, aware that they were outmatched in skill and awareness, became more erratic, their movements jerky, their voices rising slightly in frustration. The woman's stomach tightened, fear and anticipation twisting together. She knew that the next moments would be decisive, that the warrior's skill and her own awareness would be tested beyond anything she had faced before. The tall man finally made a tentative move, a step forward meant to intimidate, meant to provoke. The Apache shifted slightly, bow lifted, fingers on the string. The river's murmur seemed too quiet, the night holding its breath. Woman felt the tension coil around her like a living thing. The first strike, the first arrow, the first act of violence, or the first misstep could erupt at any moment. Everything hinged on the instant before action, on patience, on calculation, on courage. The men's faces were set, hard lines of anger and desperation etched in the flickering starlight. The warrior's stance was immovable, unyielding, and yet ready. The woman felt the life within her stir, a reminder that stakes were higher than fear, higher than survival. The wind carried another rustle, this time closer, the shadows shifting in the trees. The tension on the riverbank reached a point that seemed almost unbearable. Each second stretched, each breath laden with anticipation, each heartbeat a reminder that the climax of the night was imminent. She pressed herself slightly backward, eyes darting between the men and the warrior. Every muscle tensed, every sense sharpened. The river flowed beside them, dark, relentless, indifferent, a witness to the impending confrontation. The men were circling now in a slow, deliberate pattern, knives and eyes fixed, calculating their chances against the unseen advantage of the Apache. The woman's mind raced, replaying every decision, every path, every mistake that had led to this riverbank, knowing that the first movement could tip the delicate balance between life and death. And as the stars above blinked faintly through the darkness, as the river murmured along its course, and as the wind stirred the branches with soft, haunting whispers, the woman understood that the night had reached its most critical point. The moment before action, before confrontation, hung heavy, taut with anticipation. Every instinct screamed that what was about to unfold would change everything, that danger was at its most intense, that courage, skill, and fate would collide in a final test on the riverbank, leaving no certainty, no easy path, and no promise of survival. The tension on the riverbank snapped like a drawn bow. In an instant, the night erupted with motion, a collision of fear, courage, and survival instinct. The tallest man lunged forward, knife raised, his desperation finally breaking through his earlier hesitation. But the Apache warrior moved with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural, stepping to the side, letting the man's momentum carry him forward. A flash of steel met nothing but air as the knife passed harmlessly by, and the smaller man froze, realizing that their carefully built threats had crumbled in a heartbeat. The river whispered beside them, cold and indifferent, carrying the sounds of the confrontation downstream. The woman stumbled slightly backward, her breath coming in sharp bursts, but the warrior's presence anchored her. He did not speak, but a slight gesture of his hand toward the riverbank told her to stay low, to trust him. She followed without question, knowing that instinct and experience had brought him here, that his life and skill were now intertwined with hers. The man with the cruel grin moved next, swinging wildly at the warrior, but every strike was anticipated. Every motion countered with precision honed by years in the wilderness. A flick of the wrist, a quick step, and the man was disarmed, his knife skittering across the ground and landing with a dull clatter in the mud. Panic overtook the three men in those few moments. The tallest one scrambled to regain balance. The wiry man glanced at the river as if considering escape. The warrior's eyes, dark and unwavering, held them in place, had taught them without words that recklessness would cost them, that violence without skill was no match for someone who understood the land and the night. The woman felt a surge of relief, the tension that had pressed so tightly against her, chest loosening just slightly. But the danger was not entirely gone. They were alive, still breathing, and still capable of harm if given the chance. The river, flowing silently beside them, seemed to mirror her emotions. Cold, relentless, but carrying life forward despite obstacles, it reflected the rhythm of the night, the steady pulse of survival. The warrior guided her further along the bank, eyes flicking constantly to the men who had begun to retreat slowly, shame and fear etched into their faces. He moved deliberately, giving her time to adjust to the sudden shift from imminent threat to cautious reprieve. Every step was measured, every motion calculated to maintain safety, and she realized how deeply she depended on his skill and awareness. The woman's thoughts returned to the months that had brought her hitherlong, solitary journey, the journal her husband had left behind, the notes and maps guiding her through the frontier. She had walked countless miles, evading danger, reading the land, surviving on instinct and determination. And now, standing at the riverbank, she understood that every lesson, every choice, every moment of courage had led to this encounter. The Apache warrior had arrived as if fate itself had drawn him, and together they had confronted a threat that could have ended her life and the life she carried. The three men were finally backing away, fear replacing their earlier aggression. Their bravado had evaporated under the weight of his presence, leaving only the stark reality of their situation. The tall one cursed under his breath, a muttered vow that carried more defeat than promise. The wiry man stumbled backward, glancing at the river as if weighing the risk of crossing into the unknown wilderness. And the man with the cruel grin, now unarmed, hesitated before finally stepping away, leaving the riverbank behind. The night held a fragile peace, but the lesson had been delivered clearly. The wilderness and those who understood it were not to be underestimated. The woman exhaled, a shuddering breath that carried both relief and lingering fear. She had survived, yes, but she understood that survival was rarely the end of struggle in the frontier. Her eyes met the warrior's, gratitude reflected in their shared silence. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that spoke volumes of courage, skill, and the quiet satisfaction of a life spent defending those who could not defend themselves. The river continued its slow, steady flow, carrying away the echoes of danger and leaving behind the stillness of night. They moved away from the riverbank, deeper into the shadows of the forest, the woman careful to step where the ground was stable. She thought of the life she carried, small and insistent, a reminder of the future she must protect. The warrior walked beside her, his presence a shield, his awareness extending to every shadow, every whisper of wind. They moved in silence, the kind of silence that spoke of trust and understanding. The knowledge that danger could still exist even when immediate threats had receded. As they reached a clearing farther from the river, the woman allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to let the tension of the night seep out of her body. She touched her belly gently, feeling the small life within, and realized that courage, hope, and survival were all intertwined in ways she had never fully understood. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving, and unpredictable, but it was also a place where bravery and wisdom could turn the tide. She had experienced it firsthand tonight, guided and protected by someone whose understanding of the land and life itself surpassed her imagination. The warrior crouched briefly, scanning the edges of the clearing, then gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, sinking to the ground with a mix of exhaustion and relief. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of river and forest. The stars above seemed brighter now, as if acknowledging the temporary safety she had gained. The river's steady murmur provided a soothing rhythm, a reminder that life moved forward even in the aftermath of chaos. They sat together in silence for a few moments, listening to the forest around them. The woman reflected on the danger they had faced, the three men, their greed, their recklessness. She thought of the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, and the courage that had brought her this far. She realized that fear and danger were inseparable from life on the frontier. But so too were resilience, wisdom, and the unexpected kindness of strangers, or in this case, the steadfast bravery of a warrior. The Apache spoke at last, his voice low and measured. "The danger is gone for now," he said, eyes still scanning the darkness. "But the land is full of those who will not wait, who will not hesitate to take what they want. You must move carefully, always aware, and trust your instincts." His words carried weight, not just as advice, but as the distilled wisdom of someone who had survived countless nights like this one. The woman nodded, absorbing the lesson, understanding that survival required vigilance as much as courage. She thought of the future, of the life within her, and felt a swell of hope mingled with caution. The frontier was unpredictable, but the night had shown her that bravery and skill could turn the tide. That danger could be confronted and overcome when met with awareness and courage. She glanced at the warrior, understanding that their paths might not remain entwined forever, but that his presence had made all the difference in the world. He had protected her when she could not protect herself, had guided her through a moment where fear threatened to overwhelm, and had reminded her of the strength that lay within both herself and those willing to fight for others. The forest around them seemed to exhale, the rustle of leaves softer now, the wind gentler. The river flowed steadily, carrying the memory of danger downstream, leaving behind a sense of hard-won peace. The woman allowed herself a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement of survival and resilience. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and cruelty, and had emerged still standing, still carrying the life within her. The night had tested her in ways she could never have anticipated, and she had discovered strength she did not know she possessed. The Apache rose silently, glancing at the riverbank one last time to ensure the three men had truly gone. He then turned to her, offering a hand to help her to her feet. She took it without hesitation, feeling the firmness of his grip, the quiet assurance that he had guided her safely through the storm of the night. Together they began to move away from the river, stepping carefully through the underbrush, the path uncertain but the immediate threat gone. Every step forward was a small victory, a testament to vigilance, courage, and the unexpected intersections of lives on the frontier. The woman allowed herself to think of the days ahead, the miles she would still need to travel, the unknown dangers that lay in wait. She knew that the frontier held no guarantees, no promises of safety or comfort, but the events of this night had reinforced a truth she had always known deep down: the wilderness, and the people who understood it, demanded respect, courage, and awareness. She had witnessed the power of a single individual's skill and bravery, and she had learned that survival depended on both instinct and wisdom. As they walked, the river murmured beside them, the trees whispered in the wind, and the stars shone down as if marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. The woman felt a deep sense of gratitude for the warrior who had appeared when she needed him most, for the strength she had found within herself, and for the life she carried, fragile yet resilient, like the first light of dawn. She knew that danger would always exist, that the frontier was a place of uncertainty, but she also knew that courage, awareness, and the bonds formed in moments of peril could carry her through even the darkest nights. By the time the moon rose high, casting silver light over the forest and the river, the woman felt a quiet peace settle over her. She glanced at the Apache, who moved with the same silent grace that had guided her through the night, and understood that some stories of the frontier were not only about survival, but about trust, courage, and the unexpected kindness of those who chose to stand against danger. The river flowed on, the wilderness breathed around them, and the woman, carrying hope and life within her, stepped forward into the unknown, strengthened by the lessons of the night, aware that while challenges would come, bravery and wisdom would always be her allies. The night, once filled with imminent danger, had passed, leaving behind the echoes of struggle and the quiet triumph of resilience. The river reflected the first hints of moonlight, the forest whispered around them, and the woman felt the weight of survival settle into her bones. She had been tested, she had been saved, and she had learned truths that would guide her through the days ahead. And in the quiet of the wilderness, she understood that courage, hope, and vigilance were not just tools for survival. They were the very essence of life on the frontier, the ties that bound her to the land, and the promise that even in darkness there could be light.